The security footage from Tucson Medical Center's staff parking garage captured Dr. Grace Dalton's kidnapping in brutal, high-definition clarity across 4 camera angles that would later be analyzed by federal investigators, broadcast on national news, and studied frame by frame by people trying to understand how a cartel could operate so brazenly on American soil. At exactly 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, Dr. Dalton finished her shift in the emergency room where she'd worked for 18 years and walked toward her Honda Accord carrying the exhaustion that defined 12-hour trauma shifts. 6 armed men emerged from 2 black SUVs with military precision, surrounding Grace before she could reach her car, before she could scream, before the hospital security guard making rounds 3 levels above could respond to what was happening. The lead kidnapper, later identified through facial recognition as Mateo El Trueno Ruiz, spoke directly into the security camera with deliberate clarity. "Nathan Dalton, we have your wife. She is alive and will remain alive if you follow instructions exactly. Wait for our call. Do not contact police. Do not mobilize your club. Grace's life depends on your cooperation." The abduction took 47 seconds from initial approach to the SUVs speeding out of the garage, Grace struggling against her captors but unable to break free from professionals who'd clearly trained for exactly this scenario. Maya Dalton, the 21-year-old nursing student who'd met her mother for dinner before Grace's shift, witnessed the entire kidnapping from her car 2 rows away where she'd been texting friends before driving home. Maya's 911 call came through at 11:48 p.m., her voice breaking with terror as she described armed men taking her mother, described the vehicles and their direction, described feeling completely helpless while watching her mother being stolen by people who moved with the confidence of those who believed they were untouchable. The call recording would later become evidence in federal prosecution, Maya's voice preserved forever saying the words that would haunt her. "They took my mom. They just took my mom and I couldn't do anything. Please, someone has to help her. Please." Nathan "Crossfire" Dalton received Maya's hysterical call 60 seconds after the kidnapping, the chapter president's mind immediately shifting from the business meeting he'd been conducting into tactical mode that prioritized information gathering over emotional reaction. "Maya, are you safe? Are you injured? Did they see you?" When his daughter confirmed she was physically unharmed but emotionally destroyed, Nathan's next questions came with clinical precision. "How many men? What weapons? Which direction did they go? Did you recognize any faces?" Maya provided details through her tears, her nursing training helping her compartmentalize enough to give accurate intelligence that Nathan immediately began processing for response planning. The call from Mateo Ruiz came 7 minutes later, the cartel operations chief's voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd conducted dozens of kidnappings. "Nathan Dalton, your wife is in our custody. She is unharmed currently. She will remain unharmed if you deliver to us the shipment your club intercepted 3 weeks ago, 400 kilos of cocaine valued at $12 million wholesale. You have 72 hours to arrange delivery. Instructions will follow. If you're ready to witness how one woman's kidnapping triggered the largest multi-club mobilization in American history, how 3,000 bikers from 7 organizations rode to the Mexican border not for war, but for negotiation that exposed corruption reaching into congressional offices, and how a father's desperate attempt to save his wife revealed that sometimes the real enemy wears an American flag pin rather than cartel colors, hit that like button and subscribe because this story will take you into the darkest corners of political corruption, impossible choices, and the terrifying power of unprecedented unity among traditional enemies united by a single purpose: bringing Grace Dalton home alive. Nathan's immediate response to Mateo's ransom demand revealed the fundamental problem. "We don't have your shipment." 3 weeks ago, Tucson PD intercepted a cocaine shipment in a traffic stop. We had nothing to do with it. You've kidnapped my wife over something we didn't do. Mateo's laughter was cold and dismissive. "Nathan, do not insult my intelligence. Our information indicates Hell's Angels Tucson chapter was responsible for the interception through corrupt police contacts. You have 72 hours to return our property or Grace dies. The choice is simple. $12 million in cocaine or your wife's life. Choose wisely. The call ended before Nathan could protest further, leaving him with impossible equation. Produce drugs the angels didn't have, or watch his wife die for a crime they hadn't committed. Samuel Priest Morrison found Nathan in the Tucson clubhouse 20 minutes after Mateo's call, the vice president's weathered face showing the concern of someone who'd served as Army chaplain for 12 years before joining the Angels and understood both tactical challenges and moral complexity. Priest was 53 years old, had counseled dying soldiers and traumatized veterans and broken families, and had developed the ability to provide spiritual guidance without religious dogma that made him the club's conscience and moral anchor. "Brother, what do we know?" Nathan filled him in on the kidnapping and the ransom demand for drugs they didn't possess, his voice steady despite the terror consuming him. "Grace has been taken over something we didn't do. They think we have a shipment that Tucson PD actually intercepted. And even if we could somehow obtain 400 kilos of cocaine in 72 hours, delivering it means admitting to drug trafficking and putting every brother at risk of federal conspiracy charges." Priest processed this with the analytical mind that had made him effective chaplain, able to see beyond immediate crisis to larger patterns and connections. "Nathan, why would Black Thunder Cartel believe we intercepted their shipment when it was actually law enforcement? Who gave them that information? Who benefits from them thinking we're responsible?" The questions crystallized Nathan's thinking, forcing him to look beyond the obvious kidnapping scenario to potential manipulation underneath. Someone set us up. Someone told Black Thunder that we were responsible for their loss to create exactly this situation. Grace taken, impossible ransom demanded, angels forced to either produce drugs we don't have or watch her die. This isn't about the shipment. This is about destroying the club or destroying my family. Someone wants both outcomes. Agent Rachel Torres had been investigating Black Thunder Cartel for 6 years, ever since her husband David, also a DEA agent, had been killed during a raid that went wrong when someone inside law enforcement had tipped the cartel about timing and tactical approach. Rachel's investigation had been personal before it was professional, and she'd built cases against Black Thunder with the meticulous patience of someone who understood that one mistake could let killers escape justice. When the alert came through about Grace Dalton's kidnapping, Rachel recognized immediately that something about the incident didn't fit Black Thunder's typical patterns. They were brutal when necessary but rarely kidnapped civilians without strategic purpose, and taking a Hells Angels president's wife guaranteed massive retaliation that would disrupt their operations more than any confiscated shipment justified. She pulled surveillance from the hospital parking garage and found something that made her investigators' instincts scream warnings. One of the kidnappers had briefly looked directly at a specific camera angle before the abduction began, as if confirming it was recording, as if wanting the kidnapping documented. Professional kidnappers avoided cameras or disabled them. They didn't deliberately perform for them unless documentation served a purpose beyond simple crime commission. Rachel ran facial recognition on all 6 kidnappers and found something interesting. 3 of them had previously worked as security contractors for Congresswoman Linda Martinez, the Arizona representative who sat on Homeland Security Committee and had been facing questions about her connections to border security contracts awarded to companies she partially owned. The connection might have been coincidence, except Rachel had been tracking Martinez for 4 months based on intelligence suggesting she was using Black Thunder Cartel to eliminate people who threatened her political career. Sheriff Donald Crawford had been on Black Thunder Cartel's payroll for 8 years, receiving monthly deposits to offshore accounts in exchange for providing intelligence about law enforcement operations, warning about pending raids, and occasionally facilitating evidence loss that prevented prosecutions. Crawford was 56 years old, had been Pima County Sheriff for 16 years through 4 elections, and had convinced himself that his corruption was victimless. He wasn't directly hurting anyone, just allowing certain criminal operations to proceed while focusing department resources on violent crimes and public safety. What Crawford hadn't fully understood until 3 months ago was that his handlers within Black Thunder ultimately reported to Congresswoman Martinez, and that his corruption wasn't protecting drug operations but enabling political eliminations that Martinez orchestrated through cartel proxies. The call he'd received 2 weeks ago from Martinez's chief of staff had been explicit and terrifying. "Sheriff Crawford, we need you to provide Dr. Grace Dalton's work schedule and movement patterns to our associates. Dr. Dalton witnessed something 3 months ago that could become problematic for the Congresswoman. We need her relocated to a secure facility where she can be persuaded not to share what she saw." Crawford had wanted to refuse, had understood that relocated to secure facility meant kidnapping and that persuaded not to share meant murder. But Martinez's chief of staff had been clear about consequences of non-cooperation. "Sheriff, you've been receiving payments from our organization for 8 years. We have documentation of every transaction, every warning you provided, every case you sabotaged. Refuse this request, and all of that documentation goes to federal prosecutors, media outlets, and your opponent in next year's election. Your choice is simple. Help us handle this Grace Dalton situation, or spend the rest of your life in federal prison while your family faces bankruptcy from legal fees." Crawford had provided Grace's hospital schedule, her parking patterns, her security vulnerabilities, while telling himself this was no different from information he'd provided before. But watching news coverage of the kidnapping, seeing Maya Dalton's tearful interviews, understanding that he'd enabled the abduction of an innocent woman whose only crime was witnessing something Martinez wanted hidden, Crawford felt the weight of his compromises crushing him. He'd crossed lines he'd sworn never to cross, had enabled violence against civilians rather than just looking away from drug trafficking, had become the kind of corrupt official he'd once despised. And the worst part was understanding that confessing might save his soul but wouldn't save Grace Dalton, that his corruption had already set events in motion that his belated honesty couldn't stop. Eric Nomad Walsh sat in his apartment calculating how deeply his gambling addiction had destroyed not just his own life, but potentially Grace Dalton's, his hands shaking as he reviewed the timeline of his betrayal. 6 months ago, Eric had developed what started as recreational sports betting into compulsive gambling that consumed his paycheck, his savings, and eventually led to borrowing $200,000 from a loan shark who'd turned out to have Black Thunder cartel connections. The collections had been civil at first, just phone calls and polite reminders about the importance of honoring debts. Then they'd become threatening, photographs of Eric's elderly parents, suggestions about what happened to people who didn't pay, offers to work off the debt through services to the cartel. "We need information about Nathan Dalton's family," the collector had explained 3 months ago. "His wife's schedule, his children's movements, security around his home. Provide this information, and your debt is reduced by $50,000. Continue providing useful intelligence, and the remaining $150,000 disappears." Eric had rationalized the cooperation by telling himself that the cartel just wanted leverage for business negotiations, that they wouldn't actually hurt civilians, that he was protecting his parents from violence by cooperating with demands that seemed relatively harmless. He'd provided Grace's hospital schedule, had confirmed that she was Nathan's wife, had noted that she typically left work late when parking garages were empty. He'd told himself the information wouldn't be used for anything terrible, that he was just satisfying debt obligations through intelligence sharing rather than direct criminal activity. But watching news coverage of Grace's kidnapping, seeing Nathan's face showing anguish that Eric had directly enabled, understanding that his gambling addiction had been weaponized to facilitate the abduction of a woman who'd never done anything except be married to the wrong person, Eric felt guilt consuming him that no amount of rationalization could diminish. The second call from his handlers came 18 hours after Grace's kidnapping, their instructions revealing how thoroughly Eric had been used. "Eric, the situation with Grace Dalton is proceeding as planned. Now we need information about Nathan's likely response. Will he mobilize the club immediately? Will he attempt rescue operations? Will he cooperate with ransom demands? You're our inside source on how Hell's Angels think and operate. Provide accurate predictions and your remaining debt is forgiven. Fail to cooperate and your parents face consequences for your obligations. Eric understood in that moment that he'd never escape the debt, that cooperation would only lead to more demands and deeper involvement in operations that would eventually require him to choose between his club and his family. The only path forward was confession, telling Nathan everything, accepting whatever punishment the club decided, and hoping that his honesty could somehow help recover Grace before the cartel killed her. Maya Dalton hadn't slept in the 36 hours since watching her mother being kidnapped, her nursing student training providing enough medical knowledge to understand the terrible things that could be happening to Grace in cartel custody while being useless to actually help. She'd given multiple statements to police, FBI, and DEA agents, had described every detail she could remember about the kidnappers and their vehicles, had reviewed security footage until the images were burned into her memory. But providing information felt passive and inadequate when her mother was suffering somewhere Maya couldn't reach. Her brother Alex was deployed with his Army Ranger unit in Syria, unreachable except through emergency military communications that took hours to process. Her father was orchestrating response through the Angels while trying to shield Maya from the tactical realities of what recovering Grace might require. And Maya was trapped in the terrible helplessness of being unable to do anything except wait and hope and imagine scenarios that grew darker as hours passed without contact. The text message that arrived on her phone at 2:47 a.m. from an unknown number changed everything. Maya Dalton, this is Carmen Ruiz. My brother Mateo has your mother. I am an immigration attorney in Nogales. I oppose everything my brother does, but I love him and don't want him killed in the war that's coming. Your mother is alive and unharmed in a compound 15 miles south of the border. Mateo is being forced by Congresswoman Martinez to hold your mother until Martinez's people can eliminate her as witness. Mateo doesn't want to hurt Grace but will be killed if he releases her without authorization. I'm offering information because I believe there's a path where Grace survives and my brother isn't executed by Martinez or your father's club. Call me if you want to explore that path. Delete this message after reading. Maya stared at the text for 30 seconds, her nursing training providing enough critical thinking to recognize this could be trap designed to manipulate her family's response. But the specific mention of Congresswoman Martinez, the detail about Grace being witness to something, the offer of compromise rather than demands, it all felt too complex to be simple manipulation. She screenshot the message, forwarded it to her father with the note, "Dad, you need to see this now," and then called the number Carmen had provided. The woman who answered spoke with the controlled composure of an attorney accustomed to negotiating impossible situations. "Maya, thank you for calling. I know you have no reason to trust me, but your mother witnessed Congresswoman Martinez killing a federal informant in the hospital ER 3 months ago. Martinez has been using my brother's cartel to eliminate Grace before she can testify. The kidnapping isn't about drugs or retaliation. It's about silencing a witness who can destroy Martinez's political career. And my brother is trapped between following Martinez's orders to kill your mother or being killed himself for disobedience." Nathan Crossfire Dalton listened to the recording of Carmen Ruiz's call with Maya 3 times before speaking, his tactical mind processing implications that transformed his understanding of Grace's kidnapping from cartel retaliation into something far more complex and dangerous. Samuel Priest Morrison sat beside him in the soundproof room they used for sensitive discussions, both men understanding that if Carmen's information was accurate, they weren't fighting a cartel but a United States Congresswoman using a cartel as her personal elimination service. 3 months ago, Nathan said slowly, connecting pieces. Grace came home shaken from a shift, said she'd witnessed something disturbing at the hospital but couldn't discuss it due to patient confidentiality and ongoing investigation. She met with FBI agents twice after that. I assumed it was routine witness testimony about something she'd seen in the ER. I never imagined she'd witnessed a congresswoman committing murder. Priest pulled up Congresswoman Linda Martinez's profile on his tablet, studying the 52-year-old representative who'd served Arizona's 7th District for 3 terms, with reputation as tough border hawk and law and order conservative. Martinez sits on Homeland Security Committee, has pushed aggressive border enforcement legislation, receives major campaign contributions from private prison companies and border security contractors. If she's using Black Thunder Cartel for political eliminations while publicly advocating for their destruction, that's hypocrisy on scale that would destroy her career and potentially result in federal charges. Grace is the only witness who can expose that contradiction, which means Martinez will never stop trying to eliminate her. Returning the imaginary drug shipment won't save Grace because this was never about drugs. Nathan felt cold fury settling into his bones, understanding that negotiating with Mateo Ruiz was pointless when the real threat was a congresswoman who had resources and authority to order Grace's death regardless of any deal the Angels might make. We need Agent Torres. If Martinez is dirty, DEA needs to know. But Priest, we also need leverage that forces Martinez into position where she can't simply order Grace executed. We need something big enough, public enough, that killing Grace becomes impossible without exposing Martinez's involvement. Priest's response came from his chaplain background, understanding how public witness could protect vulnerable people. We need 3,000 bikers on the border. Not to invade Mexico, not to start a war, but to create situations so visible, so public, that Martinez can't eliminate Grace without everyone questioning why a congresswoman cared so much about a cartel kidnapping victim. The emergency meeting that Nathan called at 4 a.m. brought together not just Hell's Angels leadership, but representatives from 6 other major motorcycle clubs: Mongols, Bandidos, Outlaws, Pagans, Sons of Silence, and Vagos. The 7 organizations had been rivals for decades, had fought wars over territory and respect, had members who'd died in conflicts with each other. But Nathan's message to each club president had been identical and devastating. Grace Dalton was kidnapped not because she's my wife, but because she witnessed a United States Congresswoman commit murder. The cartel holding her is being controlled by that Congresswoman to eliminate a federal witness. This isn't about club rivalry or criminal operations. This is about a government official using cartels as death squads while publicly claiming to fight them. If this can happen to my wife, it can happen to any of our families. We need unprecedented response that makes Grace so visible that killing her becomes politically impossible. The club presidents sat around Nathan's table with the wary respect of men who'd fought each other but recognized common threat that transcended traditional rivalries. Marcus Reaper Chen, Mongol's national president, spoke first. Nathan, you're asking 7 clubs to coordinate a border operation that could trigger federal response, international incident, maybe military deployment. You're asking organizations that have been enemies to ride together for a woman most of us have never met. Why should Mongols risk members for a Hell's Angels old lady? Nathan's response was immediate and personal. Because Grace Dalton is an ER physician who saved lives regardless of patches or affiliations. She's treated your members after crashes and shootings without judgment or discrimination. She's a civilian who witnessed murder and is being killed for that witness testimony by a congresswoman who's supposed to represent justice. And because if we don't stop Martinez now, if we don't show that threatening our families unites us regardless of club rivalries, then every one of our wives and children becomes acceptable target for political operators who think we're too criminal to seek legal protection. The vote took 47 minutes of intense discussion and ended with unanimous agreement. All 7 clubs would mobilize their full membership for coordinated ride to the Arizona-Mexico border, creating presence so massive and visible that media coverage would be inevitable and Grace's situation would become international news story. We're not invading Mexico, Nathan clarified, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd thought through every tactical implication. We're creating the largest multi-club gathering in American history, positioned at the border, demanding federal intervention to recover an American citizen being held by a cartel at a congresswoman's orders. We make this so public that Martinez can't eliminate Grace without everyone questioning why a government official cared so much about one kidnapping victim. We force negotiation by making violence too visible to execute. Agent Rachel Torres received Nathan's call at 5:17 a.m., her DEA training immediately recognizing both the opportunity and danger in what he was proposing. Nathan, coordinating 3,000 bikers at an international border will trigger massive law enforcement response. Border Patrol, FBI, ATF, maybe National Guard. Every agency with jurisdiction will mobilize. You'll be creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that could get Grace killed faster if Martinez panics and orders immediate elimination. Nathan's response revealed he'd anticipated this objection. Agent Torres, your husband David was killed 6 years ago during a raid that went wrong because someone inside law enforcement tipped Black Thunder Cartel. You've been investigating that betrayal ever since. What if I told you that Sheriff Donald Crawford was the leak, that he's been on cartel payroll for 8 years, and that he's currently working for Congresswoman Martinez to facilitate Grace's kidnapping? Would that give you enough probable cause to investigate Martinez before she can eliminate more witnesses? Rachel felt her blood run cold as Nathan's words connected to intelligence she'd been developing for months about Crawford's suspicious interventions in cartel cases. How do you know Crawford is dirty? Nathan's answer came with the weariness of someone who'd discovered betrayal from within his own organization. Because my treasurer Eric Walsh confessed 2 hours ago that he provided Grace's schedule to the cartel to pay gambling debts. The people who collected his debts were Crawford's deputies operating on cartel payroll. Eric can provide dates, names, payment records, everything you need to prove Crawford has been protecting Black Thunder for years. In exchange for that cooperation and for information that helps recover Grace alive, Eric wants witness protection for himself and his parents. He knows the club will execute him for his betrayal, and he's accepted that consequence, but he doesn't want his parents killed for his gambling addiction. The deal Rachel negotiated over the next 90 minutes violated multiple DEA protocols but provided evidence she'd been pursuing for 6 years. Eric Walsh's full cooperation, including recorded conversations with Crawford's deputies, financial records showing payments from Black Thunder front companies to accounts Crawford controlled, and most damningly, text messages between Crawford and Congresswoman Martinez's chief of staff discussing handling the Grace Dalton witness problem. In exchange, Rachel arranged witness protection for Eric's elderly parents and agreed to recommend reduced sentencing for Eric's cooperation, though she couldn't prevent club justice for his betrayal of Nathan's family. Eric, you understand that witness protection doesn't apply to you, Rachel said bluntly during their interview. You betrayed your club president's wife to pay gambling debts. Federal protection won't save you from angels finding you eventually. The best you can hope for is that your cooperation helps save Grace, and that gives you something meaningful to die for. Eric's response showed he'd already accepted his fate. I know I'm dead. Whether the club executes me today or tracks me down in 5 years, I'm not surviving my choices. But maybe if Grace comes home alive because of information I provided, maybe that balances some of the evil I enabled. My parents don't deserve to die for my addiction. Save them, use everything I know to stop Martinez, and tell Nathan I'm sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have left to offer. Rachel took his statement over 4 hours, documenting 8 years of Sheriff Crawford's corruption, 3 months of Eric's cooperation with Grace's kidnappers, and the entire network connecting Black Thunder Cartel to Congresswoman Martinez's political operation. By 9 a.m., she had enough evidence for emergency warrants targeting Crawford, Martinez's chief of staff, and 6 cartel members directly involved in Grace's kidnapping. Sheriff Donald Crawford was arrested at 10:43 a.m. in his office by FBI agents executing warrants based on Eric Walsh's testimony, his face showing not surprise but exhausted relief as he was read his rights and led out in handcuffs past deputies who trusted him. The perp walk was broadcast live on local news, the sight of Pima County's top law enforcement officer being arrested for cartel corruption becoming instant national story. Crawford's attorney negotiated cooperation agreement within 6 hours, the sheriff providing detailed testimony about 8 years of protecting Black Thunder operations, 14 specific instances where he'd sabotaged investigations or warned cartels about pending raids, and, most crucially, recordings of conversations with Congresswoman Martinez's staff discussing Grace Dalton's elimination. Congresswoman Martinez ordered me to provide Dr. Dalton's schedule, Crawford testified in sworn deposition. Her chief of staff was explicit that Grace had witnessed Martinez killing a federal informant at the hospital and needed to be eliminated before grand jury testimony. I provided the information because Martinez threatened to expose my corruption if I didn't comply. I'm guilty of everything you're charging me with and more. But I wanted on record that this kidnapping was ordered by a sitting member of Congress who's using cartels as her personal death squad. Carmen Ruiz met with Nathan and Priest at a church in Nogales, Arizona at 2 p.m., her presence on American soil risky but necessary for the negotiation she was proposing. Father Esteban Garcia, the 62-year-old priest who ran migrant shelters on both sides of the border, facilitated the meeting in his office where he'd counseled thousands of people trapped between law enforcement and criminal organizations. "Mr. Dalton, my brother Mateo is not a good man," Carmen began, her attorney's precision evident in every word. "He's committed terrible crimes for Black Thunder Cartel, but he's also my brother, and he's trapped between Congresswoman Martinez's orders to kill your wife and his understanding that executing an innocent woman will make him the kind of monster even our family can't forgive. Mateo has Grace in a compound 15 miles south of the border. She's unharmed currently. But Martinez's people are pressuring him to eliminate her before your motorcycle clubs create the international incident that makes Grace too visible to kill quietly." Nathan studied Carmen with the assessment of someone trained to identify manipulation versus genuine offer. "Why should I trust you? Why should I believe Mateo wants to release Grace when he's the one who kidnapped her?" Carmen's response revealed the family dynamics that had brought her to this meeting. "Because Mateo called me 3 days ago crying, saying he'd made a terrible mistake accepting Martinez's contract, that he'd kidnapped a doctor who saves lives instead of taking them, that he didn't know how to escape the situation without being killed by Martinez or by your club. My brother is a criminal, Mr. Dalton, but he has children who still love him, a mother who prays for his soul, siblings who remember when he was a good person before cartels consumed him. I'm proposing an exchange. Mateo releases Grace unharmed to neutral custody. Father Garcia can serve as intermediary. In exchange, you don't hunt Mateo, don't execute him, allow him to disappear into protection that I've arranged in South America, and all of us cooperate to expose Congresswoman Martinez's use of cartels for political eliminations." Priest leaned forward, his chaplain's experience recognizing the moral complexity of what Carmen was proposing. "You're asking us to let your brother escape justice for kidnapping in exchange for Grace's life. You're asking Nathan to prioritize his wife's survival over punishment for the man who terrorized his family." Carmen nodded, her attorney's training providing framework for impossible ethical calculations. "Father Morrison, I'm asking Mr. Dalton to choose between revenge and recovery. Mateo can release Grace alive and disappear, or he can be hunted and killed while Grace remains in cartel custody where Martinez can order someone else to eliminate her. The pragmatic choice is the one that brings Grace home. The righteous choice is the one that might get her killed. I'm betting Mr. Dalton loves his wife more than he loves vengeance." The decision Nathan made in that moment would define him for the rest of his life. "I accept your terms with one modification. Mateo releases Grace to Father Garcia's custody at the border crossing in Nogales at exactly 6 p.m. today. At the same time, 3,000 bikers from 7 clubs will be positioned on the American side, creating presence so visible that Martinez can't order Grace killed without international attention. Once Grace is safely across the border and in FBI custody, Mateo has 12 hours to disappear before we start hunting him. That's the only mercy he gets. A 12-hour head start to run as far and fast as he can. After that, if we ever find him, he answers for terrorizing my wife. But for 12 hours, he gets to choose between life in hiding or death facing consequences. That's more mercy than he showed Grace when he put a gun to her head and threw her in an SUV. The mobilization began at 3 p.m. as motorcycle clubs from across the Southwest converged on Nogales, Arizona, the distinctive roar of thousands of Harley engines creating sound that could be heard for miles. By 5 p.m., nearly 3,000 bikers had gathered on the American side of the border crossing, their formation organized by club but unified by common purpose. News helicopters captured aerial footage of the unprecedented gathering. Hells Angels, Mongols, Bandidos, Outlaws, Pagans, Sons of Silence, and Vagos, organizations that had been enemies for decades now standing together in display of force that was somehow more intimidating for its discipline and coordination than any chaos could have achieved. Nathan stood at the front with presidents from the other 6 clubs, their presence at the border creating international incident exactly as planned. Congresswoman Linda Martinez watched news coverage of the border gathering from her Washington, D.C. office with growing panic that her carefully constructed political career was collapsing in real time. Her chief of staff had been arrested 4 hours ago based on Sheriff Crawford's testimony. Crawford himself was cooperating with federal prosecutors and providing evidence of 8 years of corruption, including specific instances where Martinez had ordered witness eliminations. And now 3,000 bikers were at the border demanding Grace Dalton's release in spectacle that had attracted international media attention and questions from congressional colleagues about why Martinez hadn't publicly condemned the kidnapping or called for federal intervention. "We need to eliminate Dalton immediately," Martinez told her remaining loyal staffers, her voice carrying desperation that revealed how completely her situation had deteriorated. "Call our contacts in Black Thunder. Tell them to execute Grace Dalton right now before this becomes even bigger scandal. Mateo Ruiz dies with her if necessary. Eliminate everyone involved and claim it was cartel violence we had no connection to." The order was transmitted at 5:47 p.m. to 3 Black Thunder sicarios, positioned near Mateo's compound with instructions to kill both Grace and Mateo, eliminate all witnesses, and escape before American law enforcement could respond. What Martinez didn't know was that Agent Rachel Torres had been monitoring all communications between Martinez's office and known cartel contacts for 6 hours, that FBI tactical teams were already positioned around Mateo's compound, and that the execution order Martinez had just issued was being recorded on federal servers as evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. The sicarios never reached the compound. They were intercepted by FBI teams 3 miles from the target and arrested without resistance when they realized they'd been set up. Their phones contained the execution orders from Martinez's burner number, their weapons matched ballistics from previous cartel murders, and their testimony would later provide devastating evidence that Martinez had personally ordered multiple political assassinations over 3 years. Grace Dalton walked across the Nogales border crossing at exactly 6 p.m., escorted by Father Esteban Garcia and Mateo Ruiz, her appearance triggering cheers from 3,000 bikers that echoed across the international boundary. She was visibly exhausted, her hospital scrubs dirty and torn from 3 days in cartel custody, but she was alive and walking under her own power. Nathan broke through the crowd and reached his wife in seconds, their embrace captured by dozens of cameras broadcasting live to millions of viewers worldwide. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered against Nathan's chest, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry you had to mobilize the club. Sorry I couldn't protect myself. Sorry I witnessed something that put our family in danger." Nathan's response came through tears he rarely allowed himself to shed in public. "You have nothing to apologize for. You survived. You're home. That's all that matters. Everything else is just details we'll handle together." Mateo Ruiz stood 10 feet away under Father Garcia's protection, his face showing complex mixture of relief and dread as he watched the reunion he'd enabled by choosing Grace's life over Martinez's orders. Samuel Priest Morrison approached Mateo with the deliberate movements of someone delivering judgment. "Mateo Ruiz, you kidnapped an innocent woman on orders from a corrupt politician. You terrorized a family to serve someone else's criminal agenda, but you also chose to release Grace alive when you could have followed orders to execute her. That choice doesn't erase your crimes, but it earns you the 12-hour head start Nathan promised. You have until 6 a.m. tomorrow morning. After that, if we find you, you face justice. Use your time wisely." Mateo nodded his understanding and turned to leave, but Grace's voice stopped him. "Mr. Ruiz, why did you let me go?" "Your orders were to kill me. You could have followed them and protected yourself from Martinez's retaliation. Why choose differently?" Mateo's response revealed the humanity that remained beneath his criminal exterior. "Because my daughter is training to be a nurse, Dr. Dalton. She's 20 years old, wants to save lives like you do. When I looked at you in that compound, I saw my daughter's future if she succeeds, saw the kind of person she wants to become. I couldn't kill that. I couldn't murder the life my daughter is working toward just because a politician ordered it. So I chose to let you live and accept whatever consequences follow. Tell your husband I'm sorry for the terror I caused your family. It doesn't change what I did, but I want you to know I understand the evil I committed and chose to stop committing it." He walked back across the border into Mexico, disappearing into the crowd on the other side, beginning his 12-hour head start that would ultimately take him to Argentina, where Carmen had arranged new identity and protection. The arrest of Congresswoman Linda Martinez happened at 8:34 p.m. in the House chamber where she'd been attending evening session, FBI agents executing warrant while cameras captured her shocked expression and futile protests. The charges were staggering: conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, corruption, using her office to facilitate cartel operations, and ordering the elimination of federal witness Grace Dalton. Martinez's perp walk dominated news coverage for days, the sight of a sitting member of Congress being arrested on the House floor becoming instant historical moment. Her attorney attempted to negotiate cooperation agreement, but prosecutors refused. Martinez had ordered too many murders, had corrupted too many officials, had used her position to facilitate too much violence to deserve any consideration beyond the maximum sentences federal law allowed. Eric Nomad Walsh stood before the assembled Hells Angels at midnight in a private ceremony where club justice was administered away from law enforcement oversight. He'd confessed his betrayal, had cooperated fully with federal investigation, had provided evidence that helped save Grace and expose Martinez, but he'd also enabled Grace's kidnapping through his gambling debts and weakness. "Eric Walsh, you betrayed your president's wife to pay gambling debts," Nathan said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment the club had authorized him to deliver. "You enabled her kidnapping, her terror, her 3 days in cartel custody. Your cooperation with federal authorities and your role in exposing Martinez doesn't erase that betrayal. You're hereby out bad permanently. You'll enter witness protection under federal custody. If you ever leave that protection, if we ever see you again, you'll face execution for your crimes against this club and this family. Do you accept this judgment?" Eric Nomad Walsh accepted the judgment with the exhausted resignation of someone who understood he was receiving mercy he didn't deserve, his voice barely audible as he responded, "I accept. I betrayed Grace, betrayed Nathan, betrayed every brother who trusted me. I chose gambling over loyalty, chose debt payment over protecting a woman who'd never done anything except be married to my president. Federal protection doesn't erase what I did. It just delays the consequences I deserve. If I ever leave witness protection, if you ever find me, I'll accept execution without resistance. That's the least I owe for the evil I enabled." Nathan nodded once, and 2 federal marshals escorted Eric out of the clubhouse toward the protection program that would define the rest of his life. The brothers watched him leave in silence, understanding that betrayal from inside was worse than any external threat because it poisoned the trust that made brotherhood possible. Grace Dalton spent her first night home surrounded by family, Nathan holding her while she processed 3 days of captivity that would require years of therapy to fully unpack, Maya sleeping on the floor beside their bed, unwilling to let her mother out of sight, and Alex, who'd been granted emergency leave from his deployment, arriving at 3 a.m. and simply holding Grace's hand without speaking for an hour. Dr. Catherine Mills, Grace's colleague from the hospital ER and personal friend, had prescribed anxiety medication and sleeping aids, but Grace resisted chemical help in favor of physical presence of people she loved. "I kept thinking about how I'd never told you all the things I should have," Grace said quietly to Nathan in the darkness. "How I'd taken for granted that we'd have time, that there would always be tomorrow to say the important things. Mateo told me the third day that Martinez had ordered my execution for that night. I thought those were my final hours, and all I could think about was how much I loved you and how I'd never said it enough." Nathan felt tears burning his eyes, his voice rough with emotion as he responded, "Grace, you say it every time you treat someone in the ER without asking about insurance or criminal history. You say it every time you defend bikers to your medical colleagues who judge them by their patches. You say it by being the kind of person our children want to emulate despite having me as their father. I've known you loved me for 22 years. I didn't need the words because I saw it in your actions every single day. But I'm grateful we have more time to say the important things, more years to be together, more chances to be better than we were yesterday." They held each other in the darkness, two people who'd built a life together despite the vast differences between ER physician and motorcycle club president. Their marriage tested by 3 days of terror but ultimately strengthened by the understanding that they'd each choose the other over everything else, including their own safety. Samuel Priest Morrison died 4 days after Grace's rescue, killed not in dramatic confrontation but in the quietest and most devastating way possible, assassinated by a sniper positioned 847 yards from the Tucson clubhouse where Priest had been conducting his morning routine of coffee and reflection before the day's activities. The .308 round hit him in the chest with precision that suggested professional military training, dropping him instantly before anyone could respond. The investigation would later reveal that the shooter was a contractor hired by remnants of Congresswoman Martinez's network, loyalists who believed killing the Angels' vice president would be revenge for exposing Martinez and destroying her political operation. The shooter was captured 6 hours later, attempting to cross into Mexico, his interrogation revealing that Samuel Morrison had been targeted specifically because intelligence suggested he was the moral center of the club, that removing him would destabilize the organization more than killing Nathan would have. The funeral that the Angels organized for Priest drew 8,000 people. Bikers from dozens of clubs, veterans from his Army chaplain years, families he'd counseled through addiction and loss, and people whose lives he'd touched through 20 years of serving as the Angels' conscience and spiritual guide. Nathan delivered the eulogy with voice breaking in ways his brothers had rarely witnessed, his grief for losing his best friend and moral anchor completely visible. Samuel Morrison believed that wearing a patch didn't disqualify you from being a good man, that choosing outlaw life didn't mean abandoning ethics or compassion. He was Army chaplain who counseled dying soldiers, then became Angels' vice president who counseled broken bikers. He negotiated Grace's release not through threats or violence but through appeal to Mateo Ruiz's remaining humanity. He died because people who profit from corruption couldn't tolerate someone who lived by principles they'd abandoned. Priest's death is proof that the most dangerous thing you can be in a corrupt world isn't a criminal. It's someone who refuses to compromise their values regardless of what that costs. Agent Rachel Torres arrested the final members of Congresswoman Martinez's criminal network over the following 6 months, her investigation revealing corruption that extended into 3 state governments, 2 federal agencies, and 12 private security companies that had received contracts through Martinez's influence. The evidence Martinez had tried to destroy through Grace's elimination became the foundation of RICO prosecution that resulted in 47 convictions and complete dismantling of the network that had connected political corruption to cartel violence. Rachel's work earned her promotion to special agent in charge of the DEA's Southwest Division, but she declined the position in favor of retiring after 22 years of service. "I joined DEA to stop cartels from killing people like my husband," Rachel explained during her retirement press conference. "I'm leaving because I learned that sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear suits and flag pins instead of cartel colors, and fighting them requires methods that federal agencies can't officially employ. I'm grateful for my time in law enforcement, but I'm more grateful for people like Nathan Dalton who were willing to coordinate 3,000 bikers to save one woman because it was the right thing to do, regardless of whether it was legal." Congresswoman Linda Martinez's trial dominated national news for 14 months, the evidence against her so comprehensive that her attorneys abandoned defense in favor of mitigation arguments that failed to resonate with jurors. The testimony was devastating. Sheriff Crawford describing 8 years of taking orders to protect cartel operations and eliminate witnesses. Eric Walsh explaining how his gambling debts were weaponized to enable Grace's kidnapping. 3 Black Thunder sicarios detailing specific political eliminations Martinez had ordered over 3 years. And most damningly, Grace Dalton's account of witnessing Martinez kill a federal informant in the hospital ER and the subsequent 3 days of terror when Martinez tried to silence that witness testimony. Congresswoman Martinez used her position to coordinate the kidnapping and attempted murder of an American citizen on American soil, the prosecutor argued in closing statements. She ordered the elimination of a physician whose only crime was witnessing Martinez commit murder. She corrupted law enforcement officials, hired cartel sicarios as her personal death squad, and attempted to murder anyone who threatened to expose her crimes. The evidence is overwhelming, the guilt is certain, and the sentence must reflect the magnitude of her betrayal of public trust. Martinez was convicted on all 63 counts after jury deliberation lasting 4 hours, her face showing shock that her political connections and legal defense hadn't protected her from consequences. She was sentenced to 17 consecutive life terms in federal supermax prison, becoming the first sitting member of Congress to receive such sentence and one of only 3 Congress members ever convicted of ordering murders. Her attorney's appeal focused on arguing that the 3,000 biker border demonstration had prejudiced public opinion and made fair trial impossible. But appellate courts ruled that public attention didn't constitute prejudice when evidence of guilt was as comprehensive as Martinez's case presented. She would die in prison, her political legacy destroyed, her name synonymous with the worst corruption American government could produce. Carmen Ruiz continued her immigration law practice in Nogales, using her connections to help families navigate the complex systems that trapped them between American immigration enforcement and Mexican cartel violence. She maintained occasional contact with Nathan through intermediary channels, providing updates about Mateo's life in Argentina, where he'd opened a small restaurant and was apparently trying to build legitimate life away from cartel operations. "My brother asks me to tell you that he thinks about Grace every day," Carmen relayed during one encrypted call 18 months after the kidnapping. "He says seeing her walking across that border alive when he could have followed Martinez's orders to kill her, that was the first good choice he'd made in 15 years. He knows you're probably still hunting him, that the 12-hour head start doesn't mean forgiveness. But he wanted you to know that Grace's survival gave him hope that he could be something other than the monster cartels made him." Nathan listened without responding immediately, his feelings about Mateo complex and unresolved even after 18 months. "Carmen, your brother terrorized my wife, put her through 3 days of hell that still gives her nightmares, traumatized my daughter who witnessed the kidnapping. The fact that he ultimately chose not to murder Grace doesn't erase what he did. It just means he stopped being a monster before completing the monstrous act he'd started. Tell Mateo I'm grateful Grace came home alive, and that gratitude is why I'm not actively hunting him in Argentina. But if he ever returns to the United States, If he ever involves himself in cartel operations again, if he ever harms another innocent person, the debt he owes my family comes due immediately. He lives free because Grace asked me to honor the 12-hour head start I promised. That's the only reason he's alive. Make sure he understands that. Maya Dalton graduated from nursing school 2 years after her mother's kidnapping, her experience witnessing Grace's abduction and subsequent rescue, transforming her understanding of what healthcare professionals face beyond hospital walls. She specialized in emergency nursing like her mother, but added focus on treating victims of violence and trauma with particular attention to supporting families through recovery. Watching my mom being taken taught me that medical training isn't enough, Maya explained during her graduation speech that drew 400 attendees, including dozens of angels who'd mobilized to save Grace. Healthcare professionals need to understand the systems of violence that create our patients, the corruption that enables that violence, and the communities that organize to protect each other when institutions fail. My mother was saved not by law enforcement or government intervention, but by 3,000 bikers from 7 rival clubs who united because one doctor's life mattered more than their territorial disputes. That's the kind of coordination and commitment I want to bring to emergency nursing, recognizing that healing trauma requires addressing the violence that caused it. Alex Dalton completed his Army Ranger deployment and returned to civilian life with clearer understanding of what his family's experience had revealed about institutional corruption and community response. He enrolled in law school with specific focus on constitutional law and government accountability, his military background providing framework for understanding how systems could be perverted by individuals who prioritized power over duty. My mother was kidnapped on American soil by a cartel operating under orders from a United States Congresswoman, Alex wrote in his law school application essay. She was saved by the largest motorcycle club mobilization in history, organizations that federal authorities usually prosecute but who proved more committed to protecting an innocent woman than the government officials who were supposed to serve that function. I'm pursuing law degree because I want to build accountability systems that prevent Martinez-level corruption and recognize that sometimes justice comes from unexpected sources, including communities that society labels as criminal. The multi-club alliance that had formed to save Grace Dalton maintained unprecedented cooperation for 3 years following her rescue. The 7 organizations that had coordinated the border demonstration continuing to work together on issues affecting their families and communities. They established formal protocols for responding to threats against members' families, created intelligence sharing networks that helped identify corrupt officials before they could weaponize law enforcement against clubs, and, most significantly, demonstrated that organizations with decades of rivalry could prioritize common interests over traditional conflicts when circumstances demanded it. The alliance eventually dissolved as clubs returned to their normal territorial operations, but the precedent remained, proof that unity was possible when leadership chose cooperation over conflict, when protecting families mattered more than pride, when the alternative to working together was allowing their communities to be victimized by corruption. They could only fight through coordination. Father Esteban Garcia continued operating his migrant shelter on both sides of the border, his role in facilitating Grace's release cementing his reputation as someone who could negotiate between criminal organizations, law enforcement, and civilian populations trapped between them. He maintained contact with both the Dalton family and Carmen Ruiz, serving as informal mediator for the occasional communication that passed between them. Grace's kidnapping and rescue revealed something important, Father Garcia reflected during a sermon 3 years after the events. We live in a world where corruption can reach the highest levels of government, where cartels operate as enforcement tools for politicians, where the systems designed to protect citizens sometimes victimize them instead. But we also live in a world where 3,000 people from rival organizations can unite to save one woman because her life matters, where criminals can choose humanity over orders, where families can survive trauma and emerge stronger than they were before. Both realities exist simultaneously, the corruption and the redemption, the violence and the protection, the despair and the hope. Our challenge is recognizing both truths and choosing which one will serve through our daily actions. Grace Dalton returned to work at the Tucson Medical Center ER 6 months after her kidnapping, her colleagues initially concerned that trauma would prevent her from performing at the same level, but discovering that her experience had somehow made her more effective rather than less. She specialized in treating victims of violence with particular focus on recognizing signs of corruption-enabled crimes, patients who'd been targeted by officials abusing authority, families trapped by systems that should protect them but instead enabled their victimization. Being kidnapped on Martinez's orders taught me that medical professionals can be witnesses to crimes that powerful people desperately want hidden, Grace explained during Grand Round's presentation about her experience. I witnessed Martinez kill a federal informant, and that witness testimony nearly got me murdered by the congresswoman who was supposed to represent my interests. But it also revealed that corruption can be exposed, that communities can mobilize to protect their members, that speaking truth about what you witness matters even when it's dangerous. I'm back in this ER because this is where I can continue witnessing, continue documenting, continue ensuring that crimes committed against my patients don't go unnoticed or unpunished. 5 years after Grace's rescue, Nathan "Crossfire" Dalton stepped down as Tucson chapter president to focus on family and legitimate businesses the club had developed through decades of operation. His legacy would be defined not by territorial expansion or criminal enterprise, but by demonstrating that loving your wife meant mobilizing 3,000 bikers to save her, that protecting family required unprecedented alliances with traditional enemies, and that sometimes justice came from communities organizing themselves rather than waiting for institutions to function properly. I joined the Hells Angels because I wanted brotherhood and purpose, Nathan said during his retirement speech to assembled members. I'm leaving chapter presidency because I found something more important through Grace's kidnapping, understanding that the patch doesn't define us as much as what we're willing to do to protect the people we love. We mobilized 7 clubs, created international incident, exposed congressional corruption, and brought Grace home alive. That's what the patch means. Not the criminal reputation or the outlaw lifestyle, but the commitment to being there when it matters most, doing what's necessary regardless of cost, protecting our families when institutions fail that basic responsibility. Their story serves as a reminder that political corruption can reach the highest levels of government, that powerful people will use any tools, including cartels, to protect their interests, and that sometimes the only justice available comes from communities organizing themselves rather than relying on institutions that have been compromised. Congresswoman Martinez thought she could eliminate a witness using cartel proxies without consequences because her position provided immunity from normal accountability. She learned that 3,000 bikers creating international incident made her crimes too visible to hide, that sheriff's corruption could be exposed by gambling-addicted treasurers seeking redemption, and that ordinary people like Grace Dalton, who simply witnessed murder and refused to stay silent, could destroy carefully constructed political careers. Martinez will die in prison. Sheriff Crawford serves 23 years for corruption. Grace lives with PTSD from her kidnapping, but also with knowledge that her survival exposed evil that had operated with impunity for years. And the 7 clubs that rode to the border proved that even traditional enemies can unite when protecting family matters more than preserving rivalry. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring institutional corruption, community response when systems fail, and the extraordinary things ordinary people do when survival requires unprecedented cooperation. Share this with someone who needs to understand that political power without accountability enables atrocity, that witness testimony matters even when it's dangerous, and that sometimes justice requires 3,000 motorcycles at an international border creating spectacle so visible that murder becomes politically impossible. Grace Dalton was targeted because she witnessed a congresswoman commit murder. She survived because her husband coordinated the largest multi-club mobilization in history and because a cartel enforcer chose her life over his orders. That combination, institutional failure and community response, corruption and redemption, violence and protection, defines the world we actually inhabit rather than the world we pretend exists. Recognizing that truth, choosing which side to serve through our actions, protecting the vulnerable when institutions fail, that's the challenge Grace's story presents to everyone who hears it. Some people choose corruption and power. Others choose witness testimony and survival. The difference between those choices determines whether we live in a world where Martinez wins or a world where Grace comes home alive.